We're beginning part 10 of the endocrine system, page 621, and we're picking up the sort of overview of the remaining tissues that we haven't seen before. There's a number of interesting factors that are a part of the system that we need to look at, and mostly we'll take them up in situ and sort of during the time of when we're looking at that tissue. Adipose would be an exception. There is a molecule called leptin that has a role to play when sleep is functional and going well. Leptin expresses itself at night as part of the nighttime cocktail, and it's in counterpoint and complement with insulin that happens by daytime, and it's ultimately checking with the body's appetite sensations and complex responses to food and adequacy with regard to the adipose tissue. The digestive tract has its own hormones that we'll take care of in the digestive tract, but there's many of them. There's gastrin coming from the stomach, there's cholecystokinin and many others coming from the secretin and all of that coming from the digestive tract. In the heart, there's atrionatriuretic peptide that tells us that there's enough blood pressure and that the kidney doesn't need to make an adjustment. There's always that conversation between the heart and the kidney in which the kidney needs blood pressure and it asks the heart to pull back a little bit harder on the string and let the arrow go further and harder. If there's not enough blood to push the heart open, then the heart cannot really pull back on the string, as it were. And so the kidney needs to have its effect on the heart. And then until the heart has that extra blood, it doesn't put out its ANP. The kidneys are also looking at the oxygenation of the blood, and we have a molecule called Epo Erythropoietin that's produced by the cortex of the kidney. And in the time when we're beginning, we just decided to become a messenger in downtown San Francisco and ride a track bike and become really fit and deliver messages. And so now our body needs way more red blood cells in order to handle the oxygen carrying that's required of a bicycle messenger. So we produce more EPO. The same thing would happen if we decided to move to Lake Tahoe or to someplace like Denver or Mexico City, where we're at a higher altitude. We would have to produce EPO. We would have to have a higher concentration of red blood cells. So these are all sort of little extra pickups that happen. And the skin, of course, I mentioned before, plays a role in vitamin D production, a steroid hormone. The thymus, which we haven't really looked very closely at, produces thymosins, which are hormone molecules that activate T cells. The blood makes lymphocytes as part of its output, and some of the lymphocytes are T cells and B cells. The T cells actually have to pick up some activation from the thymosins, so that's a requirement. Okay, then I'm going to be presenting you with a paper, or two papers actually, from PubMed Central. And the importance of these papers are not to be underestimated. They happened in the year 2002 at the very beginning. This journal came about, as you can see, April 2002 was the very first paper that was produced by this journal. And as is the habit of scientists, they tell the story in that first paper. Do you see how we have the way of looking up the paper here at the Cardiovascular Diabetes location on PubMed Central? This is actually Biomed Central. It's a portion of PubMed Central. These papers are fully available as PDFs or as HTMLs, and you can print the whole paper for nothing, for free, and it's intended for that purpose. Science wants us to know this information. Okay, so this is the very first paper, and let's take a look here through some of the abstract in which they're actually dealing, it says here, with both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And in this particular year was a very banner year because the two, how shall I say, spokespeople for American healthcare, the director of the CDC in 2002, and then also the Surgeon General of the United States. Both had separate announcements that were identical to each other, in that they said that the thrust of healthcare in America henceforth from this date in 2002 would not be about infectious disease as much as it would be about lifestyle and the diseases and chronic conditions and syndromes that develop as a result of our American lifestyle, our American diet, the types of exercise we are or are not getting, the type of sleep we're getting or not getting, also the food available to us in our marketplaces. So they're taking a look here particularly at diabetes. This is called cardiovascular diabetology, looking for the changes on a tissue level as to what happens when we get diabetes. And it says here these are powerful and independent risk factors for coronary artery and coronary artery disease, and stroke, and peripheral arterial disease. In part, peripheral arterial disease means that there's what's called glycosylation, the buildup of plaques, glycolytic plaques, certain places of the body, particularly in the retina. There could be the aging of the retina, which results in blindness, and then the aging of the kidney, which happens much faster in the diabetic, and they lose perfusion of their kidneys. And then also the most poorly perfused part of the body are the feet, toes, ankles area in older people. And so sometimes diabetics lose their lower limbs as a result of what we call glycosylation. Okay, so then they say here also that atherosclerosis, which is that plaque development of interest here, it would include also the plaque that develops from cholesterol. But it's a very complex change in the structure of the walls of capillaries. Remember, we have 40 to 50 trillion cells, and they need to eat every day, every second, in fact, with oxygen and water, and they have to have the waste products of metabolism removed. That happens at a capillary level, and inside the capillary, between the capillary wall and the cell, we describe that as endothelial matrix. And so the matrix is what's changing. Okay, so they say that atherosclerosis accounts for virtually 80% of all deaths among diabetic patients. Also, when you consider the need for kidney transplants, 80% of kidney transplant patients are diabetics, type 1 or type 2. Prolonged exposure to hyperglycemia is now recognized as a major factor in the pathogenesis of atherosclerosis in diabetics. We can switch to a lower portion now of the results of this study. This is really a review paper, but they talk here about the development of inflammation that leads to something called metabolic syndrome. And so the ultimate change in the wall structure is something that I want you to know, that there's going to be a buildup ultimately, besides oxidative stresses and that sort of thing. We're going to end up with the formation of advanced glycosylated end products. Okay, if you take the acronym of that word combination, it ends up being AGES. It's a little bit of lab humor, ultimately, that basically diabetics are aging, or people with metabolic syndrome are aging more quickly than the rest of us. Okay, so I'm going to pick this up in our next episode here.